We're going to go right to the first panel. Want to invite Amy Harder from National Journal and our panelists to come on up. Topic is going to be what makes clean energy different. I think if you had asked this question 10 years ago, you wouldn't have elicited some strong responses. But now that we've got a good many years of experience of seeing venture money flow into the space and a lot of other investment, we've got a lot of lessons learned, and we'll certainly hopefully cover that in this panel. Go ahead, Amy.
Great. I want to thank everybody for being here this morning. And before we get started, I'll introduce our panelists. On the far, we have Mitch Tyson. He's the co-chair of the New England Clean Energy Council and also principal at Tyson Associates. Next to him, we have Matthew Nordan, vice president, and Venrock, who was one of the questioners to Governor Patrick. And then we have, closest to me, is Bill Wiberg, general partner of Advanced Technology Ventures. So I think the governor's conversation really is a great segue to what we want to talk about. And I would love to keep it a conversation. So if you have any questions, we will have a Q&A session at the end, but please don't hesitate to raise your hand or jump up and down and get our attention if you have a question as we're discussing among each other. So for my first question, I'm going to steal the name of our panel, which is what makes clean energy different? In our pre-panel discussion, some of us weren't totally sold on the idea that clean energy really is all that different from traditional sources of energy. So let me start with you, Bill, closest to me. What do you think makes clean energy different, and do you agree with that premise?
Amy, I think I'm going to maybe answer it a little. I was not on the pre-panel phone call, so maybe I'll take a bit of a different tack on this. And not so much compare clean energy or renewable energy to traditional energy sources, but compare clean energy or clean tech, as the category is sometimes called among venture investors, to other categories of venture investing, because I think there is a difference, and I think it's manifested itself over the last 5 years. And I think it's had impact on how the venture community has acted in the tremendous enthusiasm there was for, call it clean tech investing, in the 2005 to 2007 or 2008 period, and how some of that enthusiasm has frankly waned broadly, not among probably people in this room, but if you look more broadly, certainly there have been changes. So why is clean energy or clean tech different than other categories for venture investors? Just a little bit about ATV. We're a multi-sector investor in early stage companies, primarily in the United States. We're bi-coastal, and we invest and have for 30 years in early stage companies in technology, in healthcare, and since 2004 in clean tech. So maybe the starkest contrast in many ways has been how the clean tech market has developed for venture investors over the last 5 years as compared to the traditional technology or IT markets, where I'll just say the ecosystem that surrounds clean tech investing on the commercial partnership side, I think is much less developed than it is in, say, traditional technology or biotech. Maybe biotech's the best example. When we began our investing in clean tech, we were looking at investments primarily on the supply side, so the alternative ways to generate power as opposed to on what people would call the demand side, efficiency and the like. And these are capital-intensive projects, so the scale of the projects that need to be built to be really commercially viable is very large. It's really dependent on engaging strategic partners. And that is not that different than the biotech market. In the biotech market, we do early stage investing when there's some promise for a drug for a new target. Partnerships are put together. A lot of money is thrown by strategic partners into the clinical trials. There's still a lot of risk at that point, but if it works, everybody wins. There's a good IPO market, especially right now for biotech companies, for early stage biotech companies. And there is an opportunity for strategic acquisitions that has developed over, 25 years of this ecosystem operating. If you look at the clean tech side.
And so do you invest in both biotech and clean tech?
We do.
Okay.
So this is looking at my neighbor next door as she invests in biotech companies and seeing, there are plenty of challenges, but the ecosystem is well developed. I'd say in the clean tech sector, especially on the supply side, it has been more challenging to find those partnerships, to take risk, to build the first project or first plant for a new technology. And there was enthusiasm in 2005, 2006 that those partnerships would be available, that the public markets would be accepting of risk for the big reward for early stage pre-revenue clean tech supply side companies. And frankly, that just, in my view, has not happened, at least broadly. And that has caused great challenge for companies that need to raise that next round of financing to get from technology proof to commercialization. So I think that's a big difference between biotech. I won't try to do the contrast with technology, so I can leave others to comment on that if they'd like. But the ecosystem needs to develop more fully to allow for these venture investments in early stage companies to be good investments, for the early stage investor to be rewarded for the risk mitigation that's done in those first couple or few years of technology development. And there certainly are good examples of it working, so I'm not saying it's this is an impossible task, but I'll say the ecosystem is not as developed as it is, for example, in biotech.
Matthew, what's your reaction to some of his comments, and do you think clean energy is a lot different and clean tech is a lot different from other forms?
You know, I think at a macro level, right, the song is the same no matter what area you build a business in. You need to assemble an extraordinary team and build extraordinary product and communicate how great it is and have a huge advantage over what's come beforehand, and everything follows. I do think that's a little glib and surface level, and when you get down into the detail, there are some substantial differences. I actually agree with Bill on a lot of points. I'll give you an orthogonal view to that. It's sort of a tale of two cities. You know, on one side, you have in this energy and environmental universe what I would refer to as soft tech. That's primarily about feeding programmers pizza and being able to exploit or mitigate some inefficiency. And its dynamics are a lot like, you know, what went into building Facebook or Instagram or Zynga. And these are companies like O-Power in, you know, energy analytics, Nest Labs, the smart thermostat company that we've backed at Venrock along with Google. Sidecar and ride sharing, these are all soft tech companies. The beautiful thing about that field is that the input you need to have to know if you've won or not is pretty low. You feed programmers, the app goes in the app store, people start sharing rides. You can know that in a relatively small amount of money in a relatively short amount of time. That's a good thing. The bad thing about it is that so far it looks like the IT consumer internet universe without the lottery tickets. You know, we haven't seen come out of that the extraordinary Google, Facebook level success that may be 1 in a million, but the dollars you get are 1,000,000 to 1. And that just hasn't occurred. I think it's unlikely to occur in this field because by definition, things that relate to, you know, energy or resource use probably aren't going to have the sort of fashion discretionary income appeal, you know, that the apps that my 10-year-old daughter downloads from the App Store will. That doesn't mean those aren't good businesses. It doesn't mean they can't be incredibly lucrative for founding teams who are sharp. It means we need to not just sort of take the square peg of how you start a company and how you finance it that we're used to from the IT world and try to shave that peg down for this round hole. On the other side, which Bill spoke to I think in a lot more detail, is what I think of as hard tech. Very different proposition. This is about, you know, companies like Ambry, a couple of people from that liquid metal battery enterprise here today, trying to do something really hard to create caching for the grid. You know, something that lets us not have to make exactly the same amount of power we need at the precise microsecond it needs to be consumed. Huge problem, requires substantial physical sciences innovation. You may spend an 8 or a 9-digit sum before you know if you've won or not because you're ultimately competing in a commodity market. That field, to me, is like biotech without the exit model.
Right.
You know, biotechnology is also 10, 15 years to an outcome. It also involves a lot of money before you know if you've won. But the FDA shows up and measures your progress every 2 or 3 years, so everybody knows how you're doing and can agree on how much the company's worth. And you get to declare victory halfway through the marathon when you're able to go public because, you know, there's an auction for your securities because Pfizer or GlaxoSmithKline makes an offer to buy you, right? And we don't have that yet. We don't have that well-developed ecosystem. With that said, I think people who are pessimists in this field are calling the ballgame in the 3rd inning. These are projects that take 10 to 15 years to mature. At the outcome, they can be extraordinarily successful. Most of these businesses got started 2007, 2008. It's ridiculously early.
So when do you expect us to start seeing those results?
I would say call me in 5 years. Let me give you the case study, right? So people in the room familiar with First Solar? Right? You know, giant American manufacturing success story, completely different material system for solar, cadmium telluride thin films versus silicon. It's the only thing that's been successful against silicon in the whole lifetime of the solar industry. That company was founded in 1990. It did not ship a product of any kind until 2002, 12 years. But in 2005, it went public. It had been backed, VCs wouldn't touch it, right? Too long time frame, too risky. By $150 million from the Walton family. The date of the IPO, that stake was worth 8.4 times what they had invested. 2 years later, at a stock market peak, it was worth 199 times what they had invested. You can make money doing this, but we can't approach it like, you know, IT or healthcare. That's not this.
Would you say they have
I would just comment on that, that while that's a successful investment, I think, as you said, most venture investors would never go into an investment with a time horizon of 15 or 20 years to even a big exit, because it doesn't fit within the structure of venture funds, which are nominally 10-year funds, and an expectation that there's going to be liquidity over, you know, some extension maybe of 10 years, but over, you know, on average 5 to 7 years as a target. And I think that is one of the differences that makes it hard to attract new money, new limited partner money into venture funds focused on clean tech, because they look at those time horizons.
But what inspires me is we now ask the question, that's exactly the right question. Do we need to find some way to change the companies so you can declare victory halfway through? I'd love to see that. I'd be surprised if we do. Or do we need to change the way we finance these things and not have an arbitrary 10-year limit on how long capital is locked up to go after these big outcomes? I'm really excited about the opportunity in the latter.
So, Mitch, I know that you mentor a lot of startups. What's your reaction to what these men are saying? I mean, do you agree or disagree?
Yes. We agreed we were going to take different perspectives on it, so I'm trying to be orthogonal.
Disagree on principle.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it'll be a boring panel.
So let me take an entrepreneur's point of view in this. And I think one of the things that makes it different or feels different for the entrepreneurs and the business people in this industry is that we have the opportunity to work on what is, I think, the most critical problem of this century. We are addressing something that is fundamental. The rest of the world, as they try to aspire to improved lifestyles, depends on us figuring out the resources, how to get the resources for the world to develop without destroying our planet and its climate. We're working on a problem that I know that we will love telling our grandkids about, and we'll be proud, and they will be proud of us for dealing with it. And I think that the clean energy issue is an issue that we all derive tremendous passion and energy because we're doing something really important. It's not different in the sense that we still have to build basic, fundamental, sound businesses. You have to figure out how to address the carbon, but you got to do it in a way that satisfies customers, that satisfies investors, and satisfies your employees. You have to build businesses. You have to watch the cash. You have to manage technology development, the integration of different technologies, the productization of it in a way that does not put your customers at risk. The whole issue of energy is to change the way we deal with something that we're deeply addicted to. And therefore, we're asking our customers to change the way they do things. And that is a difficult task. But it's not more difficult than any customer, any business that's developing a new product and tries to figure out how to get customers to appreciate the benefits for it and not to take additional risks. So I think there's some fundamental issues about the way other industries make their products, make their customers need their products, the way our products fit into it, that we need to use. But I think that the probably key issue, and this is where I agree with my colleagues, patience. We are in the third inning. This is look, it took us 100 years to develop a global energy system that delivers us exactly what we asked for, cheap, abundant energy. Our whole society depends on it. And now we have to, in a matter of a couple of years, although we seem to be past the CO2 limit at this point, it may be irreversible, we now need to change a global infrastructure that's worth trillions of dollars and change it to a different base. And we have to do it fast. And so I think the question is, and I think for many of the entrepreneurs, we feel a sense of urgency, but we need to also have a sense of patience. And we need to understand what our investors need, our customers need, our employees need, and pull that together in a way that gets our technologies adopted.
What else do you think is needed to prompt this change? You've talked about what entrepreneurs can do and what companies themselves can do. does there need to be more government policy, whether it's at the state and local level or the federal level? I know New England is far ahead of the rest of the country in terms of RGGI and cap and trade, but are there other things that the country can do that can help speed along this evolution?
Well, I think probably we'd all agree a carbon tax would be the most common sense, most effective way to do it.
Better than RGGI?
Better than well, actually, carbon tax you can look at RGGI as a pre-carbon tax, but in a society that uses markets to allocate capital, if we don't properly price the things that we use and things that we do, then we're going to make the wrong decisions. And right now, energy is too cheap. We are paying it in our insurance bills. We're paying it in an enormous range of different ways, but we're not paying it when we go to the pump. We're not paying it in our energy bills. And until you fix that, it's very hard to see how we make progress fast enough. On the other hand, I'm a political realist, and I do not see us getting a carbon tax. Look, we can't even get a global regime agreed to. That's not going to happen quickly. So therefore, we have to figure out other ways. And so there are a number of government policies, and certainly we have them in Massachusetts. There are some potential policies that might, certainly the regulatory one with EPA, that can have significant effects. And so certainly what we've done in Massachusetts is really significantly move the needle in creating a market, which is very, very important for the companies that we have here, to be able to sell locally and implement locally and learn locally as we take our products globally. But I think the government issue, the issue of utility regulation, I mean, utilities are government regulated. They need to change, and it's the government regulations that would change it. So the RPSs were critical in creating demand. So I think the government does have a role to play. I'm hoping that at some point the government will not need to play a role when we reach the ninth inning, and we live in a society that is renewable based and is highly efficient.
And I certainly agree with the carbon, putting a price on carbon as being the single kind of if there's a silver bullet, maybe that isn't a silver bullet, but it's closer than anything else I could think of. The other comment I'll make is just very broad, and that is that consistency and persistence of policy is really critical. And when we look at new investments, we generally discount any boost given by any government policy simply because the time frames of development for these companies, you really have no idea if they're still going to be there persistently at the time that you have a product to market. And so in some sense, they don't really create the incentive to invest. People are going to invest whether they're there or not because you don't have the assurity that it will be there at the time of commercialization. So that's the second thing. That's a very difficult thing to solve given the changing parties and politics, election cycle to election cycle.
Matthew, do you agree that regulatory policies such as EPA can be a trigger for change, or do you think you need something more explicit like a price on carbon?
In this country, I am a reluctant policy pessimist. I wish I weren't, but I am. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. Right? Everybody here is probably familiar with the up and down of the wind production tax credit over various years. This kind of hilarious thing where it was alternately 4 times over a 9-year time frame, successively allowed, put in place for a year, and then allowed to expire for a year on a 2-year congressional cycle, and in and out. And as a result, you had this square wave of policy, which was trailed by a square wave of wind deployments that went, up, down, up, down, up, down. And as a result, it's very difficult. We view it exactly the same way that Bill mentioned. When somebody comes in with a business plan that has a line item on the income statement that says product sales, we're like, okay, we like that. And then it has services contracts. All right, we're good. We'll think about that. And then it has carbon credits or offsets or something else, and we reduce that to 0 and recalculate the numbers. Not because we want to, because we have to. The sad thing is that I think, if there's a place where the U.S. is getting outcompeted, it's here. To give you an example, a few years back, I was looking at an LED lighting company. Pretty far on, substantial contracts, real income statement. And we sit down with a sales guy to do the tooth extraction exercise of going through each and every customer account and figuring out are these dollars going to come in. He says, well, one of the projects we have, it's a big lighting project in China to do street lights on this new highway that's going to get built. We're like, okay, well, show us the docs. And he sits down and he actually brings out a map and he says, well, this city's here, this other city's here, the highway's going to go here, it's this long, there's this density of lights per kilometer, and that means this many fixtures, and therefore we have this opportunity. My colleague looks at the map and goes, aren't there like 2 or 3 villages right in the middle of that road? And the guy goes, those are going to get moved. So there is this surety of policy to a kind of ridiculous end that I think we would like not to have in the U.S. I would hate it if my hometown of Winchester got moved to expand 93. It'd be pretty sad. But that certainty is so much greater elsewhere in the world that it really puts this nation at a competitive disadvantage.
I agree completely. When I'm an angel investor, Clean Energy Venture Group, and I see some of my colleagues here, when we look at small companies, if government is a major part of the business plan, if they require the government to either have a regulation or a subsidy or an incentive or a continue one or a new one, it's just a mistake. Businesses need to figure out how to do it without government. If government is there, great, and it's wonderful. But you cannot put that in there. It is tough enough serving commercial customers that do obey the law of gravity. They try to maximize their success. So I understand B2B. But the political process has a number of factors that make it very uncertain. And you cannot build a business if that's what you're depending on.
You say that companies should do it without government. What about irrespective of what the government does? Because it seems like, as many of you know, President Obama is going to be announcing a suite of climate change policies, and I predict that among those policies will be some sort of plan laying out what he wants to do with EPA regulations. But regardless, it will be a long haul to get them done, if he gets them done by the time he leaves the White House, and then, of course, they're going to be in court by the time for the next 10, 15 years at least. Do you think, given that regulatory uncertainty, the clean tech industry can continue to grow? In New England, as I'll ask in a moment, is a special part of the country in terms of moving forward regardless of what the federal government is doing. But do you think you can continue to grow even amid the national regulatory uncertainty? That doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
So I don't want to be glib, but I think it depends on what you're making, right? If the proposition is a 2% more efficient solar panel, the marginal stuff really matters. Right now, the success of your business is dependent in many ways on whether you have the lowest cost of capital. And, at least in recent years in China, you've had effectively a negative cost of capital, where there have been incentives for you to take free land, or free workforce development from a municipal or a regional government. And if you're making a 2% better solar cell, you can't beat that. If you are making a 200% better solar cell, something that is a completely different system, that's not photochemical, it's not subject to the Shockley-Queisser limit of 30% efficiency in a single junction. I hope the nerds in the room appreciated that one. But if you had, a thermodynamic system like a solar antenna, and there are companies pursuing this, totally different proposition. You're now talking cents per watt to make the thing, and 2 to 3 times the efficiency of the best that we have today. That doesn't need propping up. It doesn't need a crutch. So I think in many ways, it's easy for me to say this from the view of a financier. I think as entrepreneurs, we really need to look in the mirror and challenge ourselves. Are we making something that is so fundamentally, insanely great and better than what came beforehand that it doesn't need to be propped up by the crutch? And I think, we have to throw a big, bucket of water on the finance field, which was really stupid from 2005 to 2010. We got 200-odd solar companies doing basically the same thing, adding a couple of points of efficiency. No way in hell that more than a fraction of those companies would ever be successful. And the field, had this lemming mentality that led to those companies getting backed. That was a mistake and a misallocation of capital.
Same mistake as the number of PC companies that existed in the 1980s and 90s. It is a normal part of an industry and its growth. You do have companies that make it, that do go for incremental differences, and the winners emerge. But I think one of the things that comes to your question is the issue about clean tech or clean energy. It's not all the same. It is so varied. So if you have a technology, no matter what it is, that produces kilowatt hours, that's one thing. It's a commodity. If you have something that produces a liquid fuel, it's a commodity. If you're in the energy efficiency side, it's often much more complex and much richer in terms of the kinds of impacts you have. But each of those businesses has different challenges. So the real key on a technology that produces kilowatts is what is the prevailing price. And that varies. It varies in different parts of the country, and it varies based upon various regulatory policies. But that's where it comes. And if you're going to sell something in a commodity market, if you can beat the price by a little bit and meet everything else in terms of reliability and everything else, then you can win. If you're trying to change behavior, when someone has an option to do it or not do it, you better have a compelling value proposition. So I think it really depends on the types of technology we're talking about.
Where do you see the clean tech and clean energy, not to lump them together again, where do you see this industry in 10 years?
Boy, that's a tough question. I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm going to listen to you guys and hear,
Is that
hear what
the
you
eighth-
say.
Is that the eighth inning?
But I'll take maybe I'll take a shot at saying what.
You can say 20 years if that's easier.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's easier.
Let's go for 50.
We'll have
What I
flying
would
cars
say is
for
a
everybody.
constant. So it has been a tumultuous time, at least from, well, I'd say across the board for renewable energy companies in the last 5 or so years. The thing that is constant, and I believe will be constant for the next 10 years, is the level of innovation still addressing some of the biggest problems, really, truly the biggest problems. You made this comment before. Somebody made the comment about the exciting thing about being in this area is we're doing something fundamental. This is addressing one of the, if not the biggest problem that we face. And for that reason, the smartest people, many of the smartest people are drawn toward research in this area. So if you go to the universities, there is, despite problems with financing downstream, I guess I haven't seen a decrease in the level of innovation and commitment to coming up with big ideas to solve these problems. I think the obstacle really is more on the financing structure than it is on innovation. I like your idea of a new kind of fund that has the intent right from the beginning of having a longer time frame in selling that to investors that are targeting returns over that time frame, because there is a mismatch today for traditional venture investors and the timelines for the most disruptive ideas. So the things that are getting funded, I would argue today, are often more incremental. There's a high degree of focus, including from our own firm, on capital efficiency of new ideas. These can be good ideas and they'll make a difference, but they may not be the disruptive and biggest idea where more risk is taken, more capital is required, and a bigger win could be had at the end. So when I look 10 years out, that's the question in my mind, is do we find a way to bridge that gap again so that there's enthusiasm to take risk early because you have some confidence that if the idea is good enough, that there's money behind you to bring it fully to commercialization. And that's why that's such a hard question for me to answer. I'm optimistic simply because it's so necessary that one would think there must be a way, but that path is not, today it's really not clear to me.
Necessary because of the global warming challenges?
Yes, yeah, and necessary because if you take a long enough time frame and the energy we have won't be sufficient, and in the intervening time will certainly create too much greenhouse gas.
So I'm a big fan of learning from history, and I think things go in cycles. So let me give you an analogy. We are sitting here in June of 2013, and we are looking at a sort of energy and environmental innovation. I keep trying to avoid the word clean tech because I'm not a fan of it, but of that field that is frankly on a downswing, right, of investment and of company creation. But let's look back 10 years at another field, at the internet, right? In 2003, also on the downswing of an enormous bubble in venture creation and investment. A large amount of pessimism. If you were to go to an event like this, focused on the internet in 2003, you would have seen a panel of catalysts for innovation, investors, journalists, with a bewildered look on their face saying, where do we go from here? You know what happened in 2004? Google went public and Facebook was founded. I've got to believe that with the inventiveness that, as Bill indicates, doesn't stop. You don't stop getting brilliant minds out of MIT that are driven by passion to change the world. You don't stop getting company formation with extraordinary people, like some of them in this room, who are motivated by impact. There are going to be big wins. We just need to, not wake up the morning of, what is today, June 21st, 2013, and say the way it is this morning is the way it shall be forever.
It seems like, yeah, you can go.
Okay. So I've been in the clean energy field for, I think, 35 years at this point. And there are moments when I despair about how little progress we've made. And there are moments when I say it's astounding how much progress we've made. I think that, it is becoming being energy efficient as you can be, and relying on renewable resources, I think is becoming mainstream. And I think in 10 years it will be mainstream. And the place that I see the most positive is among the global 1,000 companies. There is not a single major corporation in the United States or globally that doesn't have a significant sustainability program. We heard Google's. I mean, Google is not in the business of sustainability, but it is. But if you go down the list, Unilever, Philips, IBM, SAP, even EMC, 3M, BASF, any major corporation today knows that its future depends on it dealing with the issue of resource scarcity and environmental disruption. They have incorporated in their operations. Nobody builds a factory today or operates a factory today that isn't optimized to lower cost, and that means becoming as efficient as possible. And they are beginning to incorporate it in their products because they know their customers appreciate efficiency and using renewables and not disposing of stuff, so they're not filling landfills with it. And they are changing their business strategy to make everything that they sell more intelligent so it could be more optimal. So I mean, when I look at that, and it doesn't get as much publicity as it should, I am very optimistic about the rate of change that's going to occur. Combine that with the maturation of the technologies and the companies that have emerged out of the early stage, that are in revenue, many in this room, I think there's going to be a great demand. And I think what we're seeing is more involvement in those big companies, which we call strategics, in the clean energy space, in terms of being technology partners, investing, and also in terms of helping with distribution. So I think that says to me that in 10 years, I think those partnerships with strategics can make a huge difference and will make a huge difference.
And that does go perhaps back to the biotech analogy. I said before that over 25 years, maybe longer, that ecosystems develop to be very productive for both sides. And that could be different in 10 years because there's been incremental progress, I'd say, each year. In 10 years from now, perhaps that model is fully developed for this sector as it has been in others.
So Mitch's comments about energy efficiency reminds me that we have Senator Jean Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, with us today. She and Senator Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, have been pushing for the last couple of years an energy efficiency bill that would create a host of policies encouraging more energy efficiency standards throughout the country. They've tried but failed to get it through Congress in the last 2 years, and although energy efficiency is called the low-hanging fruit, it continues to be out of reach in Washington. So ahead of her comments today, I would like to hear from you guys about how important you think energy efficiency is in this space, and if you think even Washington and the government needs to do more, or if it's something that companies can do on their own.
So to give you an example in this one, energy efficiency is obviously super important, right? You know, it's the cheapest and, in many cases, negative cost way to be able to balance supply and demand on the grid and for other types of resources. The interesting thing is, how do you get people to care? I think in a commercial and industrial environment, there's pretty competitive environments now. There are people in the room who know a lot more about this, than I do. But a lot of cost has been wrung out of, commercial and industrial environments, and the payback period challenges are pretty high. You go in and you say, well, we could retrofit the light bulbs, and that has a payback of a couple of years. But that... We
saw what happened with Fred Upton and the light bulb, though.
Maybe. And you're... Exactly. And you're competing, with other uses of that same capital budget, which could be things really unrelated, like we could redo the parking lot because, people don't want to park in our creaking asphalt. The interesting thing for me is how you unlock the consumer market, because, to take electricity as an example, 40-odd% of electricity in this country is used in homes. But it's hard to have an incentive. The average monthly power bill is $150. If I can save 10% on that, if I do, great. I can't feed my family of 4 at McDonald's on that $15. So one of the companies that we got excited about, excited enough to back enthusiastically, is a smart thermostat company called Nest. You may have seen these. It's a team out of Apple led by a guy named Tony Fadell, who is the father of the iPhone and the iPod, was one of 8 SVPs reporting into Steve Jobs. And they went at energy efficiency in a completely different way, which is not how do we sell people on saving $15 a month, but how do we put a piece of industrial design on the wall that proactively takes care of you and learns your preferences versus you having to tell it what you like. And oh, by the way, you may also save some money. And that, creative thinking motivated by consumer design, I think it's been very successful in a place where some earlier products haven't gotten a lot of traction.
And it's interesting in that case, I would say that what Nest does is not really different than, from a functional perspective, than what many other products have done in many companies have tried and really not seen the adoption. I think that's an interesting insight, that finding ways to get people to care when the absolute dollar values are not huge is a challenge. That's a great example. I hadn't thought of that one.
The other angle on it is when you're dealing with energy efficiency, you're dealing with the underlying process. And it's the issue is for a company is to make sure the value proposition is compelling. And the 10% savings isn't enough compelling argument to create the change. So you've got to make the process better, not just more efficient. So if you're going to deal with let's say the air conditioning in a building, you're not delivering cold air. You're trying to deliver comfort. And in fact, the savings when you make a building more energy efficient, you can save money, and it pays for itself well. But if you can improve the comfort level and improve the productivity of the people in that building, it's 10x conservatively in terms of the payback for making that building better. And reconceiving the way energy is used, not just doing it more efficiently. So making the light bulb more efficient is great, but why do we need to light all the spaces that we have in a building or in a city when there's nobody there? What we need light for is to light the areas where we are acting. And so there are some companies that are developing smart light bulbs that only go on when there are people present, and then map that. So the question, I think it's part of that whole Internet of Everything, where making things smart so that we get what we need from it. Energy is a means to an end. Nobody needs energy. We only need the thing that energy does. And I think it's an opportunity to rethink the way our society operates and make it more efficient that way.
I do want to go to the audience for a few questions. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, there's one up at the top.
Thanks for this great panel. My name is Jim Boyle. I lead a private consortium, more than 60 global companies that are very much in accord with what Mitch was describing as strategics. Companies like SAP and EMC and Cisco and Capital One, et cetera. None of them have come out publicly in favor of putting a price on carbon. And I think there's an opportunity here for business to lead. All these companies have enterprise risk management councils that look out into the future 20 and 30 years and try to ascertain the, geopolitical instability or threats. All of them acknowledge the science around climate change and our exposure to a self-accelerating ecological collapse. And almost all of them are meaningfully motivated by regulatory regimes in Europe and elsewhere, but have not come out in America, forcefully for a price on carbon. And I'd just like your reaction to whether or not there's an opportunity here for business, and whether there is a role for business to play in providing clear leadership.
Well, I think in one sense, the answer is certainly an argument often raised against a carbon tax is that it's going to be a significant drain on the economy. So to the extent that the major commercial enterprises are supportive of it and see it as a neutral to pro-business policy, I think that would change the tenor of the conversation significantly. Here, I'm not optimistic. So, in fact, your conditional or whatever you said, a reluctant pessimist on this. It's not clear to me that this is where they are likely to stick their neck out. Take SAP as an example. It's a politically sensitive issue, and it's not related to their core business. They have the possibility of getting at odds with some of their major customers. It will take bold leadership, and if that occurs, it will be great.
Do you think bold leadership in the business community?
Within the business community, I think, driven
as opposed to government?
Individual leaders that have true passion and are willing to take the risk of stepping forward on an issue that's really outside of their core, their core business.
I think one of the comments when we were talking about where we see clean energy in 10 years. I think one of the biggest different factors in this industry compared to, say, the internet is we have a very powerful lobbying force maintaining the status quo, which you don't see that in other industries. So I predicted a slower transition because you have such powerful forces benefiting and profiting from the status quo.
Look, we can't get background checks passed in Washington. So getting a carbon tax is just not, it's just not conceivable. I mean, I think Washington could be a great force for good, and it does some really good things. But right now, the Congress is dysfunctional. So it's just not, I wouldn't have the business community put its weight behind a carbon tax right now, because I don't think it would be useful. The business community should be doing the things that Jim, your company does, which is help them to be more efficient. I mean, these days, you cannot rent a building that's not LEED certified. And we need to kind of up those standards so it's LEED Platinum is the minimum, and that zero energy buildings is the new standard. So I think that there are lots of leadership opportunities for businesses to take in their operations. In terms of Washington and lobbying Washington, I just don't see that as something that's productive right now.
We had a question right. Yeah.
Niall Henderson from BP. It's a common theme, but and discussed a lot in the press. But the impact of shale gas on clean energy when you look forward 10 years, and which of the two do you think is going to prevail, or will they both prevail? It would seem that shale gas is putting another obstacle in the way for the development of clean energy. I just wanted to get a sense from the panel whether you're optimistic that the clean tech will overcome that, or whether it will suffer from that.
Yeah, a couple of perspectives on that. There's no doubt, and we have been deficient as a panel in not addressing this up front.
I'm surprised it hasn't come up until now.
Yeah, exactly. No matter what, the most fundamental change that's occurred in the last 5 years has been that the forward futures curve for shale gas went from a range, for natural gas, went from a range of $8 to $10 per million BTU to $3 to $5 per million BTU. That's the biggest near-term thing that's happened. That creates both opportunity and it creates some challenges for some technologies. I got to tell you, the time that I've spent around people like yourself, I'm actually interested in your point of view on this, so you should speak up and talk about it. If there's one thing that's true, it's that when a feedstock becomes cheap, people tend to find things to do with it. And the big dumb, because I'm not an expert in this by any means, but the big dumb observation that I make is if you look at data from people like IHS-CIRA, which track the outstanding export applications at the level of the federal government for gas, the volume of that now equals known reserves of shale gas. So if even a fraction of those export, and many of those are to free trade countries, right? So it would take an exceptional act for them not to be improved, it will take time, for reverse LNG terminals to be built and for ships to start going across to Japan. And it will take time for Dow and DuPont to build chemical factories that take gas as a feedstock rather than petroleum as a feedstock. But in some time frame, those things happen and those prices will equalize. Now, the ability to look in a crystal ball and figure out precisely when that happens and at what price level, there are quant jocks on Wall Street who you'd ask that question of, not a humble venture investor.
I think we had a question right here.
Thank you. One of the, before we do a carbon tax, it seems to me we have to make us sell why it's needed. And we're not doing that. The business community has a responsibility to deal with the media. The media does not hear about the real need for clean energy. We have advertisements every day, at least 6 times a day, about a very attractive young woman standing there pointing to why coal and oil are important to our country. And the clean energy companies have to speak out, I think. And until we do that, we're not going to be able to get a carbon tax. And I guess I'd like to hear your comments on that.
I would go one step further and say most of the lobbying efforts on the environmental side right now is focusing on how bad Keystone XL pipeline would be to climate change, where that's diverting attention to why we need to shift to clean energy. Just as my perspective as a journalist, I'm seeing that distraction, I would call it. Do you guys have any comments about what he said?
I think, in listening to the governor's remarks, one of the areas I think we're not doing enough in is educating the public. I mean, the public, I don't think, appreciates the importance of clean energy to our state's economy and to the global economy and to the climate. The climate is nuts, And some of the reporters, some of the national media make the connection between Hurricane Sandy's, the tornadoes. I mean, fortunately, our weather in Massachusetts is still just inconvenient when it's not predictable. But there's weather in other parts of the country and other parts of the globe where it's deadly. And it's like, why isn't Hurricane Sandy a CO2 storm? But I think we're even seeing in the state issues of siting, of wind energy, wind turbine sightings, where the public doesn't, doesn't understand the imperative of it and what the choices that we're making for this generation and the next generation in terms of what's there. I think that the industry as a whole needs to reach out more and develop the political support nationally and also within the state and within the region to continue the progressive policies that you and others in the legislature have just been amazing champions of. But we can't take that for granted. We have to have a grassroots organization that understands the importance of this as well.
We have a question over here.
Thank you very much, and extraordinary panel. Let me just, my name is Mark Pacheco. I'm a state senator here in Massachusetts and one of the authors of the Global Warming Solutions Act. In that bill that passed here in Massachusetts, it's not something we have to think about whether or not government will do or not. It has happened. In that bill, there's a provision that authorizes the pricing of carbon. It's there. It's law. It can happen without the legislature. Do you think it is something we should get about the business of doing? This bill passed in 2008. We're here in 2013. There are other sectors of the economy that can be looked at to look at all the other costs you referenced just a few minutes ago that are really the costs of carbon that we're all paying for as citizens in this state and nationally and citizens of the world. We have thought, those of us in the legislature that have worked on this, is one of the most important things we can be doing. And when I've talked to members of the business community, in particular, the business community that is involved in clean energy, everyone has told me the same thing. I think the three of you have said the same thing just a few minutes ago. But yet, as the representative just indicated, we very rarely hear it talked about, publicly, outside of being lobbied individually. Companies out there and taking the position, actually asking the administration to move aggressively in this direction, for example. That type of action, we just haven't seen enough of. I'd just like to have your comment on that, about whether or not we should move forward on this.
The first thing I'll say is I was not aware of the existing legislation that would make way for that, and you've piqued my interest, so I'll do some homework after, and I've learned something that's helpful. Peter, I'm wondering if one of the reasons that when we started one of the organizations that became the New England Clean Energy Council, this was one of the areas of focus, was bringing together the constituents in the community, and it's kind of a broad set of people from different areas that have interest in clean energy. And policy certainly is one of the topics on the agenda and a real thrust for the Clean Energy Council. Peter, I might just ask you to comment on what is being done and what the obstacles might be for better and broader messaging, what we could be doing to be more helpful there.
It's a very big and important topic, and thank you, Senator, for mic on. Over here? Okay. It's a very big and important topic. Thank you, Senator, for raising the question. And I'm on the Global Warming Solutions Act Implementation Advisory Committee and working very closely with the Commonwealth on what levers are part of that legislation and how to think about phasing those in an effective way. I agree it's important to do that, and that's the detail work. I also very strongly agree there's an education effort that needs to take place. I'm not exactly sure how we go about doing that. I think we need to step back and figure out the most effective way of doing it, as opposed to just saying, let's throw some stuff against the wall, so that the populace makes that connection between the impacts on climate, on our economy, but also that it's not a choice between clean energy and climate solutions versus jobs. There is a way to make both work together, and the business community has to be front and center making those arguments with real exhibits, that show how it can work. I would say one other piece, though. It's, for the scale of climate challenges, it's not just Massachusetts, not just New England, it's not just the U.S., it's the whole world. We're flattening demand here, and yet the expectation of the forecast for greenhouse gas emissions are still going up because of growing and emerging developing economies all over the world. We need some mechanisms that can scale. And I would prioritize as much as possible, how can we do that? I'd love to see when we have, the president is going to be making some announcements about EPA rulings on power plant emissions. And Massachusetts will likely already comply because of RGGI. We should get more states to join RGGI. I mean, that's a lever to try to expand things that we can already prove are working. And let's use all of these things. But I agree, we need to be in the game on it.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Up there at the top.
Yeah. Amy, a question for you. My name is Nick Darbeloff. And I want to relate back to Chairman Smizek's question about a carbon tax in the media. Oh, I'm sorry. And the question is this. I note that Brian Williams every night never uses the word climate change, but I've got to believe it's entirely intentional that he runs a weather story or a crazy climate story every night, or as often as he can. And I'm impressed by that, and it's interesting that he doesn't mention the phenomenon, he just runs the story. As a journalist who's had experience with major media outlets, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about what the thinking is behind the scenes. Why isn't this receiving more coverage? Why isn't this being elevated more in the national media?
Are you referring to a carbon tax specifically or climate change?
No, I'd love for you to mention carbon tax, but specifically just climate change related phenomena and the urgency for action.
I think there's two reasons why there's not as much coverage. I think your example of Brian Williams, I think some journalists might be a little bit nervous, might be the right word, to make that connection when they know how politically explosive it has been in the past. I would say in the past year, it's become less so, at least in the media world. I mean, I realize the science on this issue has been settled for quite some time, but everything in politics moves much slower than that. I always describe the way the media covers climate change and the divisiveness of the issue, especially in Washington, is like a pendulum. And I would say in 2010, we really hit rock bottom with how much climate change was polarized and how the issue was covered in such a political black and white way that it wasn't about the actual issue, it was about the deniers versus the believers. And one of my biggest pet peeves is the word belief, because climate change is not a religion, it's a science. And so whenever I write stories, I always say, X, Y person acknowledged that climate change is real and greenhouse gas emissions are a cause of that, as opposed to the word belief. And so I think we're swinging back that pendulum now to where it's becoming more obvious that, at least in Washington, that it is a more an issue that's going to demand attention. I think it's starting to demand attention, but I still think there is a large contingency, especially in the Republican Party, that right now just refuse to talk about it at all. And I think eventually that refusal to talk about it will shift to having a conversation about, well, we won't do anything until China does something, or India. And so that conversation, of course, often results in a dead end. And then on the topic of a carbon tax, I attend and moderate a lot of panels in Washington, and never one goes by without the talk of a carbon tax. And even though it was never even remotely close to being introduced in Congress, you had Republicans in the House introduce a resolution that says we'll never introduce a carbon tax. And it was so funny how the academics in Washington can run away with an idea so quickly. And you have people asking Jay Carney and President Obama if he would support a carbon tax, and they keep saying point blank that we would not. And I think that, so that's one reason why I haven't covered a carbon tax specifically. I think there is somewhat of a distinction between print media, and of course I'm print, so I'm biased, but I would say print media does a better job of covering climate change in a more straightforward and science-based way. I think the broadcast media, you have 30 seconds for a shoot, you mention climate change, all of a sudden the Twitter sphere is blowing up saying Brian Williams is, talking, being a climate change extremist or something like that, and then you would have Fox News do the opposite. And so I think, while I haven't had much experience in broadcast news, I think that's one reason why they want to shy away from it, at least if you're talking about a specific weather incident. Even President Obama didn't bring up climate change when he came up to New Jersey, both times, I think, when he came to talk about Hurricane Sandy. So I do anticipate in the president's announcement next month that he will make a connection between extreme weather and climate. He did in his Berlin speech. And once that happens, I do anticipate TV and print media journalists alike to be covering this issue quite a bit more. Right here. And then we'll go up there. And then I think that'll be our last two questions.
I'd like to get back to the issue of the political versus the economic, and also tied to the carbon tax. Let's suppose California and Massachusetts, two large states and two consuming states, pass a carbon tax and then their economy changes. All of a sudden, those are two markets that are large markets that will affect the nation. So wouldn't it make sense, since the Congress nationally is not acting, for the large states to act, pass a carbon tax, and not only does the Global Warming Solutions Act have an avenue to that, but there's also a carbon tax legislation now in committee in Massachusetts that's going through hearings. So if business interested in Massachusetts and California, as two other markets, get behind a carbon tax in those two states, that will have, I think, an economic impact nationwide. You want to comment on that?
I think Reggie is probably further along in that, but I think your point is well taken. If we can expand Reggie so that 20, 25 states are participating in Reggie, then you basically have a de facto energy carbon tax. So I think I think it's hard to think about it from just a single state point of view. I think there'd be tremendous resistance of that. During the 2010, when the last time the cap and trade bill was up, we got AIM, which is notoriously focused on keeping energy costs low. We got AIM to support cap and trade because it would put Massachusetts on a level playing field with the rest of the country. So I think it's a question of just balancing some of the economics. There's sometimes value when Massachusetts moves ahead by itself, and then there are times when we need to be careful. We need to bring a lot of other states with us. Particularly, fortunately, Reggie is broadly adopted in the Northeast. I think if we can get other states to understand the benefits that Reggie has been to us and continue to ratchet Reggie so that it's stronger, then I think that we begin to approach the national political consensus that this makes sense.
So I have to say something that I'm afraid will be unpopular in this room, because this room seems very, very, very focused on carbon policy. And that's super important. It's the Lord's work. I'm glad there's a large number of people focused on it. May you be successful. We can't obsess about this stuff. There is a universe of entrepreneurs, and if the message that we send to them is, hey, what you're working on is really cool, but you know what? Nothing can really happen until we have carbon taxation. So, hang out, do something else, go make an iPhone app. We're going to lose a generation of talent that has passion for these issues and might otherwise be winnable at the margin and may not apply their efforts to it. What I get excited about is the things that either route around these issues that don't require it, which lie in things like energy efficiency, agricultural crop nutrients, water technologies, whole fields like that. And then by entrepreneurs who are developing things that are so good, they can compete unsubsidized against the stuff that's come from the past. I get pumped when I go into Richard Lester's lab at MIT and find young people with an advanced nuclear technology that would have none of the downsides of stuff that's come in the past and would have all the benefits of existing nuclear of no emissions. I get excited when the startup I've never heard of from an academic team and a national lab team that I've tracked and didn't know that they came together calls me up and said, hey, that solar antenna thing you talk about when you're in panels at events, we actually have one and it works. That's what I get excited about, and it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be every effort we can possibly apply to being able to get, an even playing field, national de facto pricing of negative externalities. But man, let's not make this the whole argument, because we're going to dissuade people.
I think that's a good, realistic tone to end the panel on. So I want to thank our panelists and then shift it over to you.
Thanks to our panelists. Great panel.